Hey, Mark, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for being here today. So my name is Chris Smallwood. I'm a research scientist in soybean breeding at the University of Tennessee, and I'm helping to coordinate the 2017 NAPB webinar series, which is called Building Better Plants for the 21st Century, Updates and Upgrades in HTP, IP, and DNA. And so thank you to everyone who was able to join us 2 weeks ago on March 1st, where we had Kevin Price talk about high throughput phenotyping and drone imagery. Today we have Julie Dawson, and I hope you all will be able to join us in 2 weeks when we have Russell Jessup. And so with that brief discussion about the webinar series, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Turner, who's going to be introducing our speaker today.
Hello, my name is Sarah Turner. I'll be introducing today's speaker, Dr. Julie Dawson from the Department of Horticulture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Dawson's background is in organic plant breeding and participatory research. She leads a program in collaboration with other plant breeders to test vegetable varieties for quality traits and productivity for regional food systems. Today, Dr. Dawson will be speaking about findings from the Summit on Intellectual Property Rights and Public Plant Breeding, which took place prior to the 2016 NAPB meeting in Raleigh, North Carolina. Thank you for joining us today, and I'll hand things over to Julie.
Great, thanks. I'm going to share my screen here so everyone should be able to see the slides. Is that working?
Yep, that looks good.
Great. So thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges in intellectual property rights that the public sector faces and the results of a summit that we had before the NAPB conference in 2016. Before arriving at UW, I worked in a few different wheat breeding programs, and this has been something that's come up many times as we try to work with others in the public sector and also in the private sector. Some of the challenges that really led to us convening a summit were increasing difficulties that public sector breeders had in exchanging germplasm with other breeders, and some of the differences that different universities had. So people wanted to share in regional testing networks or with other breeders, and every university had a different MTA or a different set of restrictions that went along with that germplasm. This is pretty tightly linked to concerns with funding, but they are separate issues. And for both the IPR discussion and the funding discussion, we were really focused on the public sector and how the public sector should handle intellectual property rights and challenges with funding. That doesn't mean that we're restricting it to only public-to-public exchanges, but we're not talking about intellectual property rights in the private sector. The funding situation has really evolved over time as federal funding levels and state funding levels have declined for public sector plant breeding programs, and more restrictive intellectual property rights are seen sometimes as a strategy to generate revenue for the public sector through through collecting royalties on developed cultivars. And so I think as public sector funding has gotten tighter, breeders and universities are more likely to try to recover some of the costs of cultivar development through royalties and through the use of intellectual property rights. So we can't totally dissociate these two things, but we want to talk some about, the purpose of the summit was to talk some about what would be a model for intellectual property rights in the public sector, and then what are some possible best practices for universities to use in returning royalties to cultivar development programs, because often those royalties currently are not entirely given back to the program that generated them. I also want to say that the purpose of the summit was not necessarily to develop a prescription for public plant breeders, but rather to give us some tools that we can use in negotiating with tech transfer offices or others at the university who may not have the same history or same knowledge of the history of plant breeding and history of exchange of germplasm that plant breeders do. We do see some opportunities in the general support for cultivar development. I'll be talking some about a survey that was done by Adrienne Shelton and Bill Tracy here at UW-Madison that surveyed public sector plant breeders about both intellectual property rights and funding. It was done in 2016. There were 229 responses. This was sent out to all names that they could find in public sector plant breeding or cultivar development or plant genetics units. 229 people responded. 192 of those were releasing cultivars. And so the results that I'm presenting from that survey are published now. The reference is at the bottom of the screen there. Cultivar development in the US public sector. It's in the first look section of crop science. As of today, that DOI is not working yet. You have to go to the first look page and then scroll down to find it, but it is posted there. So that survey found that 81% of people developing cultivars said their university somewhat or strongly supports their cultivar development work. It's seen as something that gives the university a good image with the farming community and also something that the university does to serve the public sector. Public plant breeders also valued strongly the ability to share germplasm with other breeders. And so what we want to do is develop a community standard for that. Again, not as a prescription for plant breeders, but as a tool that plant breeders can use when going to the tech transfer office and bringing these standards of sharing to them. We also identified some successful models that can ensure that the majority of royalty funds are returned to a breeding program. And so we would like the broader plant breeding community to know about these university models and perhaps be able to talk to a tech transfer office in shifting models that are maybe less favorable to plant breeders to a model that actually returns more royalties to a program. This is the general summary of who responded to the survey. They had a good mix of field crops, fruits, nuts, trees, other ornamentals. The fruits, obviously, and nuts are not ornamentals, but perennials in general, vegetables and pulses. We also had a good mix of hybrid and self-pollinating crop species. Most of the respondents were from land-grant universities, but there were a number from ARS as well. And again, most of them had tenure, so more established at those universities. One of the questions on the survey really looked at the source of new germplasm for the breeding programs and asked what the most important source of new germplasm was. And by far the largest response was from other public sector plant breeding programs. So this really speaks to the need to maintain the ability to exchange germplasm among public sector plant breeding programs because it is an important source of continued variation, which of course is important to maintain genetic gain in any breeding program. The USDA wild collections, international centers were also some of the places that people got germplasm, but by far the most important was other programs. When asked about sharing germplasm, 95% share germplasm with other breeders. That was expected. 61% always or mostly do that with an MTA, which means that the other balance of that does not always use an MTA. And 68% said the MTAs somewhat or strongly restrict their freedom to operate or use the material for breeding. If you look at those actual restrictions, most of them are for commercialization. Some are for further selection within what was exchanged. So if you got a variety, you planted it out in a field trial and then selected an off type or something, that's further selection within the exchange material. Use as a recipient for gene transfer or recurrent parent, those are all frequently among the restrictions on an MTA. Less frequent, saving seed, using it for crossing and selection, which is really what we're going to talk about in this webinar more. And then not very many restricted field testing, marker-based genotyping, or uses of sequences. For the breeders in the survey, 72%, so all of the respondents that they were using to tabulate the data were releasing cultivars. So everyone releasing cultivars, 72% of those people said that the cultivars are protected with some form of intellectual property rights most of the time. There was a fairly low use of any kind of utility patent. Most were protected by plant patents or plant variety protection certificates, and licenses were also a very common way of protecting a cultivar, licenses being based on contract law rather than plant patents and PVPs, which are in statute. 55% of the breeders said that intellectual property on cultivars, so this is not exchanging breeding material, but released cultivars, 55% of them felt like that intellectual property restricted their freedom to operate and use those cultivars in breeding. But surprisingly, maybe, almost 70% said they had a good relationship with their tech transfer office. So that says that we might have the ability to really educate people in tech transfer offices more about cultivar development and release, and perhaps modify some of the MTAs or the other intellectual property that gets taken out on cultivars in order to allow continued exchange of material among public sector plant breeding programs. To look at the funding side of things, we did want to look for the conference at where the money was coming from. It's still primarily, well, not primarily, but the biggest percentage is from the employer, so in salaries or other hard money. Commodity checkoff programs are a big source of funding, competitive grants. Royalty money is only 12.8% of the total. This is across all crops, of course, so there are variations between field crops and trees. But royalty money, a relatively small percent of the pot. Private industry and formula funds also a relatively small percent. When we look at the distribution of royalty money back to the breeding program, so the royalty money that comes in then gets distributed, usually not back to the breeding program primarily, but to the institution, to the breeder personally, to the breeder's department. What we were looking at in the summit were models that would return more to the breeding program for the continued cultivar development. So not looking at personal income or money coming back to a college, but really looking to use royalties to continue cultivar development efforts, and seeing that as kind of a pipeline that needs to continue to have basic funding in order to continue to release cultivars, which would then produce more royalty money. Budget-wise, we're looking at fairly small annual operating costs. Some public sector programs are very well funded, but the average is a relatively modest level, and 54% of breeders feel that their program is either very or somewhat underfunded. So I think most of us have seen this problem with funding continue to get worse as federal and state budgets are cut. It's part of a larger picture of agricultural research not having the funding it needs. But we're in a situation where people are looking for different sources of funding for their programs, and royalties may be part of that mix. Finally, we ask if, or Adrian and Bill ask if breeders felt like they would be replaced when they retired or otherwise left their position. 43% said yes, so that's nearly half. 23.9% said no, they would not be replaced, and another 32.8% were not sure if they would be replaced by another breeder of the crop that they work on. In general, breeders that had larger annual budgets were more likely to feel like their program was well funded, and those programs that were well funded felt like they were more likely to be replaced. Factors in feeling like they might be replaced included really strong support from farmers or the industry. People with commodity groups that were supporting breeding efforts felt like they were likely to be replaced because the university cared about serving that industry. And people that felt like they would not be replaced often cited difficulties in convincing the college that plant breeders could get enough grant money to be viable in the modern research university. So those are some of the elements that are going into that. So the summit was held just prior to the NAPB meeting. We wanted to have a good turnout of public sector plant breeders, also private sector plant breeders, and the nonprofit sector were there. We focused on funding challenges, intellectual property rights challenges, but we wanted to move beyond the challenges to really finding solutions and giving plant breeders tools to make changes at their own institutions to address some of these problems. In general, when we looked at the funding, we heard from a number of different speakers, and I have put the names of the speakers on the slides. The proceedings will be released shortly, so after this webinar, I'll give a website where the recommendations are already posted, and the proceedings will be up there shortly, so you can go and look at those papers. The funding discussion really focused on how much we can expect royalties to really support. Royalty revenues are usually a fairly small percentage of operating costs, and also few crops can really fully support themselves on royalties. So we had some examples of specialty crops generating large amounts of royalty money, but most crops are generating a modest sum that won't necessarily fund all of the operating costs of a field program. We also had a discussion about whether we should strive to fund public sector programs on royalty money, because part of the mission of the public sector is to serve farmers or agricultural systems that may not be currently served by the private sector, and the private sector may not be choosing to invest there because the profit margins are too small. So if we would like public sector plant breeding to serve a public good, expecting royalty money to support that may not be realistic. Some of the funding challenges that were identified were specifically about increasing administrative burdens as well as real cuts in the funding levels. A few of the speakers talked about the need for plant breeders to do more and more at the university and not being able to focus on their plant breeding program, which results in a cut in the full-time equivalents or the amount of time that they can spend on their breeding program. Also, in negotiating some of the trialing network funding, there seems to be a disconnect between what the breeders see as a service to farmers in their state and what existed as an extension service to farmers, trialing different varieties, running a testing network, and what the university now sees as more of a service to the industry. So testing networks existing primarily to give proprietary data back to other breeders or to the private sector. So the cost structure of those are shifting and really undermining the ability of breeders to run these testing networks, which are pretty critical for a larger plant breeding program. And finally, as the state support is cut and breeders are more reliant on federal grants, the research agenda is really being set at a national level rather than by a local or regional group. Unless you have commodity funding, a lot of the funding for breeding programs may come from outside of the region and be discussed at more of a national level. Some of the intellectual property rights challenges I've already mentioned. A few things that I didn't cover earlier are that universities see germplasm as potentially valuable, but the actual value is very difficult to predict. And so some of the the push towards more restrictions on exchange may be based on an assumption that that value is there that might never be realized. And so to restrict everything at the beginning may lead to lost opportunities to really benefit from other programs because the university is worried about losing something of value in allowing that exchange. As we've seen, universities are becoming more restrictive with material transfer agreements and release intellectual property rights. And even when the breeder protects their variety with PVP or other intellectual property rights, the university may then not defend those rights if somebody is violating them. So there may be administrative costs up front to gaining that protection, but if the university then doesn't see enough value in defending them, they may decide not to. And then that's also a cost to the breeding program. I should say these challenges are things that are identified. They're not necessarily universal. And many people, obviously responding to the survey that they have a good relationship with their tech transfer office, do have people that they work with. And those are the models that we're trying to find and make more widespread. This probably doesn't need to be said to this group, but we really depend on the ability to continue to exchange germplasm and not develop academic silos where we have population sizes within our breeding programs that are too small to really continue to support genetic gain. Because we're all at different institutions, we need to negotiate separately, individually, with our tech transfer office. And I know as a fairly new faculty member, it's difficult sometimes to have those negotiations without being able to point to a community of professionals that share the standards of exchanging material with other breeders, allowing them to continue to use that in crosses and selection. So having a standard for the community that everyone can point to and say, this is our professional standard for sharing, may help in those individual negotiations. Also, each campus has its own way of doing material transfer agreements and licenses with different terms. And this is not just a problem for exchange in the public sector, but for exchange between the public sector and the private sector, because if a private sector company wants to test lines from a number of different breeding programs, they have to go through those negotiations with every university. We heard from a number of different stakeholders at the conference, all of which supported a more uniform standard for sharing. The small and mid-sized regional companies still rely considerably on public sector releases of germplasm because they focus on running a testing network rather than running their own breeding program. Also, as public sector testing networks decline, if the university funding isn't available to maintain them, not only do breeders lose the ability to see how their lines do across different regions of their target environments, but farmers lose access to the information from those networks and to new cultivars that might be developed. As you would expect at a conference of plant breeders, we feel that plant breeding is one of the most effective types of translational research. Varieties are a very effective way to deliver the benefits of the research that goes into genetics and traits and environments, deliver that to farmers in a way that can easily be used. And universities now and in the past have continued to support this type of translational research. We can look to some of the university focus on faculty entrepreneurial activity in medical sciences and in engineering, and the encouragement of university startups to maybe find some models that work for cultivar development, even though cultivar development is a much older endeavor in a lot of ways. So the overall recommendations from the summit, again, they were focused on intellectual property rights for the public sector. We need a standard of practice for exchanging germplasm in the public sector and for releasing cultivars from the public sector. We need best practices for funding public plant breeding programs, and starting at the institutional level with royalty distribution, we can perhaps direct more of the royalties towards continued cultivar development. And then finally, we need to address capacity funding at the federal level through both the Farm Bill and also competitive grants and other capacity funds like the formula funds. And I'm not going to get into that as much, but they are in the recommendations. So in terms of germplasm exchange, the professional standard that we really looked at at the summit was the Wheat Workers Code of Ethics. And this is still in widespread use among wheat breeders. There's very similar ones in the small grains, oats, and barley. I was given the Wheat Workers Code of Ethics the first day I started grad school in a wheat breeding program, and I think it's something that people feel works well. So we've modeled a draft professional standard on the Wheat Workers Code of Ethics. That's on the webpage with the recommendations. We definitely want feedback on that, and we want to be able to publish it in a way that the plant breeding community broadly can support. That will give plant breeders the tools to go to their tech transfer office and say, this is our professional standard of practice, and we need to draft MTAs that adhere to this. It does apply, or at least the draft that we're proposing applies to public sector breeders for germplasm exchange in the public sector. So not necessarily with the private sector. This is mostly to facilitate the exchange of pre-release varieties or breeding lines among public sector breeders. We also talked about intellectual property rights to go along with cultivar release, and the general consensus in the discussion was that publicly developed cultivars should be available for breeding. So it's okay to have intellectual property rights on a cultivar, but the form of intellectual property rights must continue to allow for use in crossing and seed saving. So something similar to the Plant Variety Protection Certificate or a license that allows that continued use. The Wheat Workers Code of Ethics allows this, so the same principles apply to both the standard we're proposing for MTAs and for cultivar release. Along with cultivar release, while that material should be able to be used in breeding, plant breeders deserve a fair return of royalties for their effort if they choose. And so something like a Plant Variety Protection Certificate or a license can allow material to continue to be used for breeding while still returning royalties to the program that developed it. For royalty distribution, that is then at the institutional level. Many institutions direct most of the royalty income to either the college or the university at large, and then some to the individual breeder personally, rather than to the breeding program. There are a few models that do direct more to the breeding program to continue to function. In talking about best practices for royalties, though, we need to remember that royalties are not going to necessarily be the solution to funding, and so we can't lose sight of the bigger issues of capacity funding. However, in some institutions, particularly the University of Florida, certain crops generate enough royalties that they can also support other crops in the plant breeding department or group of faculty. And Florida has a model that's really working to support public plant breeding at that university with increasing numbers of public plant breeders there. So in Wisconsin and Florida, there's an alternate model of distribution of royalties that is kind of in parallel to the existing university policy of some money to the university, some money to the college, and some money to the inventor. In Ohio, there's a breeder's exemption, which returns a large percentage of the royalties to the breeding program. I'm going to show some of the details for the Wisconsin and the Florida models because I think these could be implemented at other universities. So it involves thinking about cultivar development more as an entrepreneurial activity. And universities often have models for developing faculty startups where a significant amount of the royalties generated go back into that startup business, because that is what they are trying to develop into a viable company. So if the university took all of the royalties back, the company wouldn't survive. It doesn't really make sense to develop a separate company for every cultivar. There's just not enough going on in terms of one cultivar to justify a separate business. It's not like a new drug discovery or a discovery of a new technology that might support a company all by itself. So the cultivars then go through another organization that's considered like the startup. So the Wisconsin Crop Improvement Association handles the releases from Wisconsin. The Florida Foundation Seed Producers handles releases from Florida. And so that entity is treated similarly to a startup in other fields, medicine or engineering. And they are allowed to keep a significant portion of the royalties. They then return those royalties to the breeding program, because that's the way they continue to generate cultivars for release and commercialization. At the University of Florida, I'm not going to go through this whole table, but I wanted to put in the slide so that you would have it. It's also in the recommendations on the website. The interesting thing about the University of Florida, first, there are 3 crops that generate about 85% of the royalty income, and the rest are more modest, but they've generated multiple millions of dollars of royalty, which now is being used to hire new faculty and support breeding programs across the university. They have a tiered system where under a certain amount, the Inventors program gets 70% of all the royalty payments. As that royalty increases, the program gets less as a percent, and more goes back to the department and college, where they can be spread across more of the plant breeding programs, which might not be generating as much revenue. Most of the plant breeding programs, or most of the cultivars released through the plant breeding programs, generate less than 50,000, so they stay in this area. But once you get a cultivar that's generating a lot, some of that money is then used to support other programs. At the University of Wisconsin, instead of going to 100% or 20% to the inventor, 65% to the university, and 15% to the department, by releasing through the Wisconsin Certified Seed Program, the Wisconsin Certified Seed Program gets 15% in operating costs and then returns a significant amount of what is left to the breeding program. So in this model, 50% goes to the Wisconsin Crop Improvement Association and 15% goes to the normal channel through the university. Of that 50%, 85% is returned to the program and 15% goes to the Wisconsin Crop Improvement Association. And then of the 50% that goes to the university is distributed along the normal lines, so that the 12.75% that goes to the department goes back to the breeding program. That allows the breeding program to capture quite a bit of the royalty stream, rather than having virtually 0% through the normal channels. Finally, talking about capacity funding, there are more details in the actual recommendations, but the main argument that we wanted to make to those funding public plant breeding is that cultivar development really serves a public good, particularly when the public sector is working on markets or with farmers who are not in large seed markets, where it's not possible for the private sector to really invest and be profitable. And if public sector breeding focuses on these markets, it's unlikely that royalties will completely support the breeding program. So this capacity funding really needs to continue if we want to serve farmers throughout the country in all different agricultural systems and different crops. And with that, I want to give you the website for the recommendations. We are taking feedback. You can email either Bill Tracy or myself. We want this to be a community document, and please do give us feedback, read through the recommendations. The proceedings will be published soon, and we would be very interested in suggestions, comments, and other critiques. With that, I will take questions.
Okay, we've got question from Cecilia. Says, did you look at the UGA system? In my experience, it works extremely well.
I'm not sure if we had a UGA person at the summit. We can definitely look at that. We've done a bit of a survey, but most of the content was from people who came to the summit.
Okay. So no other questions at this time. We'll take a few minutes though and give folks time to formulate some questions.
Everyone's asleep.
I know. Yeah, we'll give folks a minute or two. We won't hang out all for the rest of the hour if there's not questions, but certainly you can, if you'll put them in Q&A, that would be helpful, but feel free to put them in chat too if you have any questions. And we'll just take another minute or two and give folks time. If not, then we'll wrap things up. Okay, a couple questions just popped in the Q&A. Rob says, what would you say are 2 or 3 main differences in the funding challenges now and the funding atmosphere decades ago?
I think in general, agricultural research has not kept up with inflation or with other countries' investment in agricultural research. So we're in a situation where everyone's pot of money is shrinking. That goes across the public sector. Plant breeding in particular has been difficult to fund because it is a long-term endeavor and because it is something that can't be stopped and started like another research project might be able to be stopped and started. If you stop a cultivar development program, you might still have a lot of viable seed 3 years down the road, but it's not that easy to roll it back out and pick up where you left off. And so what we need is more modest amounts of continuous funding rather than large grants that fund things for 3 years and then disappear. And I think the federal government for a while was moving towards very large projects that required coordination across regions rather than smaller competitive grants. The capacity funds as well that have been historically given to research stations through the Hatch and McIntyre-Stennis funding have shrunk considerably. So funding that went for infrastructure at research stations and for the ability, for the capacity to do breeding trials has kind of dried up. So that all was still happening 10 years ago, so I'm not sure that that's a big difference between 10 years ago and today, but certainly between 20 or 30 years ago and today. I think we're seeing renewed interest, so the situation is probably actually a little bit better than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, there was a pretty major crisis in field breeding, with a lot of the research going more towards molecular genetics. And I think with the start of genomics and using genomic information, the bottleneck is now phenotyping, and so there's a lot more interest in phenotypic research and in field breeding and statistics. Obviously, the molecular genetics is still useful, but it hasn't become the main, it hasn't taken over, I guess, as a lot of people thought it was going to in the late 90s. It's a tool, but we still need the field breeding. And so we're seeing a swing back towards funding some of that applied breeding, but it's still not enough if you look at the total pool of competitive grants. And so that's where we really need to work with the USDA or building support throughout the plant breeding community, private and public sector, to figure out how to have access to longer term more modest level funding rather than having to compete for competitive grants to continue to run a cultivar development program.
Okay, great. Seth says, does emphasis on returning money to a specific crop continue investment in that crop at the expense of new crops being bred and developed?
It could. I think many of the crops that are worked on in the public sector are ones that are important to farmers. That's kind of how universities justify a public sector investment of tax dollars in that crop. If you are generating royalties to continue supporting the breeding of that crop, then you might not be moving those over to another smaller scale crop. But it's unlikely that those crops are going to generate the royalties, all of the money that they need to continue. So I think that's something we need to look at, but I think right now the more significant difficulty is that there's not enough money to do all of the plant breeding that needs to be done. Some of that's being done by the private sector. There's a lot of new seed companies that are serving the organic and small scale markets, and I think some really interesting breeding is being done by those companies. But we still all have much more work to do than we have time to do it. So I think we see more demand for plant breeding than resources at this point.
Jim says, how common is the use of licenses as the sole form of IPR?
So about 70% of the breeders that responded to the survey said that they frequently used licenses. That wasn't entirely exclusive, so they could respond to multiple forms of IP, but I think it's more common than we realize. I know several breeders who release under license only and don't seek PVP because of the expense and the time that it takes to get a PVP certificate, because they feel licenses give them just as much control. So I think more time should be spent looking at licenses because it's probably more prevalent than we really realize.
Okay. Barrett says, what are the top alternative funding sources that public sector breeders would be looking to supplement programs that are not supported by royalties? I presume government, but is this mostly just federal/USDA?
I think there was a mix of funding. So commodity boards are a major source of funding for a number of different programs. I know the program I did my PhD in was strongly supported by the Wheat Commission. We have commodity groups in mostly agronomic crops, but also groups like the potato growers that support plant breeding. That's a significant source of revenue for crops that have those groups associated with them. Other significant sources were federal grants, the private sector, and there's some other smaller pots of money, foundations or state grants, but those are all relatively small, I think, compared to the commodity boards and the federal grants.
Okay. John says, during the summit on IPR, were there any discussions that explored collaborative breeding efforts across institutions where royalties generated by released varieties are either shared amongst collaborators or are shared with those collaborators which contributed germ plasm that led to the development of the released variety?
Yes, that came up in the discussion both between public sector universities that shared royalties. So there have been a number of co-released varieties where maybe one institution developed that variety, another institution tested it, and it did much better in the institution's environment that was testing it than in the area that was bred, and then they co-release it and share the royalties. There was also some discussion about whether how release would work if there was a public sector and a nonprofit or a public and a private entity releasing. Those, I think, well, right now it's complicated. Having talked to some breeders that have tried to do co-releases, not between two universities, but between a university and another entity, it can get into months of negotiations. Often those negotiations are kind of specified in the MTA when when would the other party need to be involved. If we had a more consistent form of NPA across institutions and a more consistent release, that might be simplified. So I think one of the reasons why we didn't really get into that in our recommendations is because we felt like the first step is to get a more consistent MTA, or at least the principles guiding the MTAs across universities. And then if that standard is more similar, it'll be easier to negotiate. So it was in the discussion. It's not really in the recommendation, but it's something I think we're going to have to deal with more and more as people are collaborating more on breeding.
Dan just had sort of a comment, says just to note that clonal crops are very profitable at UC, but royalties don't seem to get back to the programs, but we're grateful for the small percentage that does come back to inventors.
Yeah. I think we saw a lot of the clonal crops being the most profitable for royalty generation in the institutions that were represented at the summit. But the policies of institutions vary widely in how much is actually returned.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions for now. We'll take another 30 seconds or 1 minute. So last chance, folks. Again, I'm going to put a link to the Learn event. That's the current event today. A link to the recording will be available there, so feel free to share that with colleagues that may not have been able to attend, or feel free to rewatch if you'd like. And then there's also a link to the slides. If you scroll down to the bottom of this page under event materials, there's a link to Julie's slide set there. And I don't see any questions left. So Julie, any closing thoughts?
No, please read the recommendations and give us feedback if you're interested.
Great. All righty. Thanks everyone for their time. We'll see you soon.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.